I really cannot imagine how many of the people viewing this, looking at this, can begin to imagine that kind of trauma, where your whole world, it's not a question of your house, your whole world has vanished, just like that. And with the constant fear that you, or the growing fear, that you would not return.
Welcome back to the Let's Talk Palestine podcast. It's an honor to have our guest today, Ghada Karmi. We're going to be speaking a bit about the Nakba and a bit of your kind of experience in your early life as you were expelled from Jerusalem. Believe it or not, this is, well, one of our 30-something podcast episodes in a couple of years of doing this podcast. And we haven't actually touched on the Nakba yet, somehow, with everything that's gone on in the last few years. We haven't actually managed to dedicate an entire episode to it. So it's an honor to welcome you today to our podcast.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here.
Thank you. So I guess we're going to be speaking mainly, I guess, a bit about the events that follow in your book, as I've got sort of displayed here to the camera, In Search of Fatima, your memoir. And the first question I'd like to ask you is a bit about the years prior to the Nakba. So I think, especially with how bleak everything has looked in the last few years, I think some of us, especially in the diaspora, we idealize sort of what Palestine looked like before the Nakba. But I guess in the years that you were growing up, in the first few years of your life following the Palestinian revolt, things might not have looked as rosy as some of us may make out to be. What are some of the earliest, I guess, memories that you have, and was there maybe a fallout from the revolt that you noticed in your earliest years?
No, because remember, I was 8 in 1948, so I wasn't that old in the aftermath of the 36-39 revolt. For me, I mean, these are childhood memories. Everything seemed fine. We had this nice house, which was one of those one-story villas in Jerusalem, in Qatamon, which is in West Jerusalem. And it was typical of the kinds of buildings that there were in that area. And it was nice, it had a garden. Remember, what is a child, what is it that concerns a child? It's things like that the house seemed comfortable, the garden one could play with, could play in, and you could come out of, there was a veranda, so you come out through the veranda, down some steps, and that took you onto the pavement, and the houses opposite. And it was a very friendly street, as lots of Arab cities are. And so I had my little friends, I played with them, we played in each other's gardens. It's those sorts of memories, and it was nice, it was home. All I can tell you is I remember it as a calm, happy time.
How was it for your older siblings? Because you speak a bit about them in that time, and I don't know exactly how old your eldest sibling was, but maybe they had a bit more of a political or societal view at the time.
I mean, I was the youngest of three, so my brother is probably the closest. He was about 3 or 4 years older than me, and I would guess that his experience was very much the same. He had a bicycle, he rode his bicycle up and down the streets and met his friends, and it was very nice. Now, it was different for my sister. My sister was the eldest of us. She's 9 years older than me, and there's a big difference, isn't there, between an 8-year-old child and, somebody who's 17. It's completely different. She was well aware of the situation. She spoke afterwards about alarm, things were not normal, things were changing in the 1940s. This is in the run-up to the establishment of Israel in 1948. So she would probably have a very different story to tell from me. But as far as I was concerned, all seemed fine until I started to realize things were not fine at the end of 1947. That would have coincided with the period immediately after the United Nations partition resolution, which was passed in November 1947. And it proposed that Palestine should be divided into one part for the Jews and the other part for people like us, so, the Arabs, as we were called. So it was in the aftermath of that, there was a lot of unrest in the country. I know historically that was the case, because the idea that you've got some foreign invaders, which is what it was, these are people from Europe. They were very unfamiliar to us. They spoke different language and different languages very often from each other. And the idea that these people who had come into our country without permission, without our having anything to do with it, that there should be a proposal that they should have half the country. It's extraordinary. So, of course, people felt very badly about that. And that percolated through to people like me because there was unrest. And my school closed. At the end of 1947, the schools closed. So I knew something was terribly wrong. For us not to go to school and see one's little friends. And it was primary school, but nevertheless, that was, very much part of my life. And I knew something was terribly wrong without knowing exactly why or how.
What were your interactions like with, did you interact with these Jewish settlers that were coming from Europe or from elsewhere? Because I think in a place like Jerusalem, there was already a bit of Jewish presence within the city, but for example, out in the countryside, the people that lived in the villages would only have seen them from a distance. What were your interactions like?
Of course, Jerusalem was a place where they all came, and there was a big Jewish presence in Jerusalem. Now, again, there were some. We had in our own neighborhood, Katamon, we had German Jews.
They lived side by side, near, like on the same street.
Yes, nearby. And they were, everything, they seemed perfectly civilized. In fact, I remember that one was a doctor, and people started to go to this. After all, these are Germans, really, this whole business of, you have to call them Jewish, but they're actually Germans. So and people were friendly. They didn't. I think even then they did not. People at our level, ordinary people, did not understand the danger that they posed. So no, it was okay for a while. And in fact, there was a family with a daughter very much of my sister's age, and they came round to see us and seemed to think the whole thing was perfectly normal and ordinary and acceptable.
So, well, I imagine at your young age you wouldn't have understood this next question that I'm going to ask, but how well understood do you think was Zionism as an ideology in society? Was it clear to Palestinians that they were coming to take over? Or was it, we don't know what they're going to come to do, some of them are fleeing the Holocaust, some of them are fleeing other forms of anti-Semitism exist in Europe. We need to give them a place to stay. How well understood was Zionism as the overarching ideology for the leaders of the...
Well, in a certain class, this is an educated class, there was an awareness of Zionism from the end of the 19th century, and people were scared. They tried to explain first to the Turkish rulers who ruled Palestine as part of the Ottoman Empire, and later to the British who took over from the Ottomans. The delegations would go and say, please, don't let these people in. They're coming to take over the country. They were quite clear about that. However, I have to say that the majority of Palestinians did not understand Zionism, did not understand the Holocaust or anti-Semitism or any of that. And you know, when I grew up and I look back, that's one of the things that made me so angry. You know, this is nothing to do with Palestine. This is a European history. These problems are European problems. How non-Jewish Europeans felt about Jewish Europeans is something European. It's nothing to do with us. And yet we were implicitly invited to try and understand them. And why should we? Really, why should we? You know, when I look back at my own life growing up in London, of course this came after 1948, I understand Zionism. I understand its European origins, but that's because I live in a part of Europe.
Yeah, of course.
How would I expect people say, like my grandfather, who was a farmer and a landowner, and he had peasants working for him, and he also worked the land himself. How on earth would I expect a man like my grandfather to understand his intricacies and the complexities of anti-Semitism and, you know, Jew hatred that was permeated the Christian West? It's outrageous that we should have been forced to try and deal with people who are, you know, who have a different history.
Yeah, of course. So I want to now start asking a bit about when things took a turn for the worse. You said that you started to understand things weren't right when school was closed. I think in your book you wrote about instances of some bombings that took place around Jerusalem. Could you describe a bit about them?
Yes. Now we're now going into the 1940s.
Yeah.
And things were beginning to happen. We were aware. It wasn't so much the bombings. I'll tell you what was the worst thing, and that was later. That would have been from 1946 onwards. What you started to get was that as families, rather nervous about the way things were changing, vacated their homes. I mean, temporarily, of course. There was no question of people emigrating, as it were. They just left for safety reasons. What would happen was the Jewish snipers would take over the empty houses and start shooting at people walking along the road. And that is extremely scary. Apart from the fact that my parents were terrified, wouldn't let us out, it's a very frightening feeling.
And because one thing that I really wanted to speak about, and you made a note of it in your book, was how, well, when we look at the history of the time, the way that it's written about now is that groups like the Irgun were terrorist groups. They are widely described as such, but other groups such as the Haganah are not. They're sort of described as a paramilitary force, I guess inherently self-defense in some way. But I think you mentioned in your book at some point that this doesn't really align with your memory of things that they did across...
No. Yeah. This is a giant hoax, this nonsense about, you know, a group of Jewish fighters who are apparently kosher, excuse the use of this term, and other groups who are not. Yeah. This is nonsense. They were all in agreement. These small terrorist groups, they're all terrorists really. The Haganah was a terrorist organization, but these small terrorist groups like the Irgun and then like the Stern Gang, these were more brutal, more obvious, in your face sort of killers, and they were called by the British, they were called terrorists officially, but it's artificial. The reality is it was coordinated with the Haganah. They were completely in agreement with, while pretending to condemn certain activities of these small groups. they were in total agreement. So the deception, the lies started from very early on.
Yeah. Well, I think that segues me on perfectly to the next point that I wanted to say, because something that might have been quite surprising for somebody that reads this book is that when it became clear that the British were going to leave, there was a sense of betrayal among Palestinians, and that might seem a bit counterintuitive considering the British were occupying Palestine. How did that play out? Why did Palestinians feel a sense of betrayal by the British?
And they did. They had a view of the British mandate was that it represented authority. It very often was a big employer, of course, of people. My father was employed by the mandate authorities in the education department. But it was seen in some senses as benevolent, so that it enforced law and order, public health was improved, things like that. And so people got used. After all, they had been ruled by the Turks. We're not talking about an independent state, which then becomes taken over. So they were, in a sense, they changed masters, but the new masters, they thought, would understand their plight and that it was difficult. Now, this only applies to a particular kind of person in Palestine. There were many others who loathed and hated the British. That was what was behind the revolt of 1936, because they could see how the British were allowing the entry of these invaders. So they knew that their real enemy was the British.
Of course.
But that was not, in our experience, at ordinary civilian level, that was not universal at all. And so when the British said, right, they're going to leave, i.e. they threw us under the bus, there was, yes, indeed, a feeling of tremendous betrayal. I mean, how could they do that, you know, people said.
Yeah.
It's very, very sad, the whole story.
I guess we've done a bit of a timeline of the first few years of your life. We've gotten to the point of 1947 where things start to take a bit of a turn. Schools close, there's snipers firing at people in the streets. How long was this period of instability, let's say, until, I guess, the straw that broke the camel's back that led for you to leave? And what was that straw?
Yeah. Now, at the beginning of 1948, there was a bombing of a hotel called the Semiramis Hotel, which was in a road above ours. And this was done by the Zionists. They planted bombs and it killed a lot of people because it was an international hotel, cosmopolitan. There were people, often journalists, who stayed from different parts of the world, and a lot of them got killed. And now that was the beginning of the reign of terror, I would say. And so people on their guard, very shocking event, that Semiramis Hotel bombing, very, very shocking.
Did you hear it? Did you?
Yeah, well, you see, now that is very much in South Fatima, that event, because I woke up in the early hours of the morning and I thought it was thunder and lightning. What else could I think? And it was only when my parents dragged us onto the floor with our backs against the wall in case something happened, that we realized something. This is not thunder and lightning. And in fact, it so happened it was that the very by coincidence, that night was indeed a stormy night. Okay. But this was something quite different. And it was, for me as a child, who had no concept of bombs or, buildings being blown up, things like that. All I could feel was my mother shaking on the floor next to me, shaking with fear. Yeah. And that made me terrified.
Of course.
Terrified. Yeah, but then it just went on getting bad and worse and worse. And then we came to the fourth month, April. By that time, most of our street was empty. Most families had evacuated, with the idea that we'll go away for a while things, quote, things settle down, unquote. So we were left, we and maybe one other family were left, and my mother used to say, the Jews aren't going to get me out of my home. They are not. I refuse. But in the end, she had to face reality. It was too scary for us. And so out of a desire to take us away from danger, the three children, my father, or both of them, I suppose, decided best thing to do was to take us away from our house and lodge briefly, temporarily, with my grandparents who lived in Damascus. So that was the plan.
Just one quick question on that. When you say that the street was empty, there weren't settlers moving into the street already. It was only sort of, it wasn't such a quick process where they were coming as soon as the house was, it took a while before. Okay.
No, not yet. But it was, I suppose, useful to them that you had these houses. That means the people were vacating, which is exactly what they wanted.
Okay, yeah. And so when you did eventually leave, you went to Damascus. Did your dad try to go back to the house, or how did it look? Was it once you crossed the border that that was the final time that?
No, not at all. We remember that the predominant idea at this time for all Palestinians was that it was a temporary evacuation in time of war. That's how people thought of it. They would not have contemplated or imagined that it would be for good. No way. So that's what encouraged people to actually to go. They thought, okay, we'll go somewhere and perch somewhere while things settle down, and then we'll come back. There was no question that people would return to their own homes. And we were typical of that type of thinking. So off we went. Now, my father, to show how this idea was so important and was so prevalent, for him, his role was to escort us safely to his in-laws and then return immediately to his job. After all, it wasn't a holiday. He wasn't taken leave. Yeah. Now, it was at this point that you might say the first rumbles of the tragedy to come became clear. When he tried to go back, he was stopped because our part of Jerusalem had fallen to the Zionists.
Stopped by who? Stopped by?
By the authorities at the border,
Sure.
who said you cannot go any further. And he, that was it. It had, Qatamon had fallen and was overrun by Zionist militias.
So how, was it a sudden realization then, would you say, that Palestine had been lost, so to say? Or was it not that deeply ingrained yet? It was still like...
No, but this is how people behave everywhere. They cannot accept that things as they've known them are over, it's all gone, they've lost everything. Of course not. They thought that this has got to sort itself out, and that the United Nations, somebody will come in and get rid of these invaders.
How did hope then progress over time as you were, I guess, starting to become accustomed to life in Damascus? As time went on, was hope still high, or did it slowly start to...
No. It began to fade. You could not deny the march of events. You couldn't deny the news. Every day there was news of another major city in Palestine being overrun by Zionists. And, you know, and when it came to May 15th, 1948, with the departure, the total departure of the British, the whole thing sank into chaos, and we watched aghast, I would say, at what was happening to the country. Dreadful. This is a dreadful story, you know. It should never have been allowed to happen, ever, ever. And you know, I often think about that when confronted with the Nakba of today, which the Gazans have and the people on the West Bank, what remains of Palestine, is being subjected to. These are all Nakbas.
I wanted to touch on that in just a bit, but I want to ask you a bit about, because something that I found interesting once you came to England, so I think you spent just over a year in Damascus?
We spent 18 months, yeah.
Yeah. Once you came to England and you were slowly becoming accustomed to sort of British life, obviously this very new lifestyle, very foreign lifestyle in some way, it's something that you weren't used to. You describe how everybody in your family was reacting very differently to what had just happened, and everybody had seemed to kind of go along their own path. How did that play out?
Well, you see, one of the things that only in retrospect I understood was that we were traumatized, deeply traumatized. I really cannot imagine how many of the people viewing this, looking at this, can begin to imagine that kind of trauma, where your whole world, it's not a question of your house, your whole world has vanished, just like that. And with the constant fear that or the growing fear that you would not return. That was the thing. So I think we were deeply traumatized. I think we behaved like automatons, which is what you'd expect. We kind of went through the motions of everyday life. We had to survive. That was the major issue for us. And therefore, if you like, how can I put it? You put away all those horrible thoughts and you parked them, and you thought, I don't want to think about this just now. I've got to get on, like that. You know, often there's an image in my mind, which is where I watch nature films, and then you see these gazelles, let's say, or whatever, giving birth, and then the little gazelle stands up almost immediately because they've got to go with the herd, even though the poor little thing would probably prefer to hang around and get used to the new world. It can't, because the herd has moved on and he's got to follow them. It was a bit like that. That image always comes into my mind.
So with this trauma, I guess, that you're all kind of dealing with in your own ways, is that something that you feel became softer over time, or do you think people remained, or your family remained, as traumatized as long as life continued, so to say?
At some level, I would think my parents never recovered, really. I don't think so. Of course, we, being younger, we tried to deal with it in our different ways. I mean, we never talked about it. So I don't know, let us say, what my poor brother must have gone through, having lost, well, I suppose his whole world. I don't really know. We never talked about it, and we were not encouraged to. You know, by the way, I mean, so many families in refugee camps were not at all like us. The children were all told about the places the parents had come from. They could almost imagine what life was like because of being told by the parents, the grandparents. This never happened for us. And I put that down to the pain, how painful this must have been for them, that they couldn't sit there and say, well, now, you know, we used to do this or this in Palestine. It's not that kind of thing.
Do you think that comes from the fact that they understood that you had experienced it just as much as them, your parents, I mean, and that everybody was kind of scared to say the first word in
No,
a way?
I honestly don't think so. I think it was about them.
Okay.
This was about their shock, their trauma, their pain. They probably thought, as we were younger and children, maybe we didn't understand what was happening and we'd recovered somehow. No, I think it's about them.
Well, now I do kind of want to begin to touch on sort of placing what you went through in kind of the modern context. And I think, well, another thing that you mentioned in your book that I found gave me sort of goosebumps as I was reading it, because you describe how during the Suez Crisis in 1956, if I'm not mistaken, how your world kind of growing up here in England in a way changed again, because the people are, for the first time, I think you described, you really felt like you weren't actually seen as a British person, as you had maybe hoped. And I remember feeling, the reason why it gave me goosebumps was because on October 7th, I felt that exact same way, where my Western, non-Palestinian, non-Arab friends, suddenly the focus was on me, and in a pretty hostile way, I would say.
Yeah.
And so I guess this is just a case of history repeating itself, even with just the Suez Crisis, which isn't, I guess, on the same level as October 7th, maybe one could argue.
Yes, sure. I mean, look, up until 1956, I had tried to fit in. Of course, you know, as a child you do. And I thought I'd succeeded. I had friends. I went to school like any one of them. Now, I remember England or London in the 1950s was not the place we know today. It was not cosmopolitan, and it was not full of brown people. It had a largely white English population. So people like us were oddities. However, I didn't think twice about it. I thought that people would see me as I saw myself, just one of them, and you know. Now, when 1956 came and Jamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal to very, very great acclaim and support amongst not just Egyptians, but Arabs everywhere. I mean, one memory that comes back to me, my mother listening to Arab radio from the Middle East on her in the kitchen, and Nasser giving a speech and addressing the Egyptians and saying something like, "You sons of the soil, this is your moment. This is yours. You have rights. This is your rights." Even I didn't understand who Nasser was. There was none of that. But I thought, I remember having a slight shiver and thinking, this is wonderful, wonderful stuff. Anyway, when I went to school, what was my horror, when nobody shared my view whatsoever. On the contrary, Nasser was the new Hitler. Of course, as we all know, over on this side of the world, whenever they don't like somebody, he becomes Hitler, whoever it is. You know, there's so many candidates. Anyway, at the time, Nasser was the candidate. He was Hitler, he was evil, he was all these things. But it was a very, very important moment for me, because I think that was the first time I understood that I was an Arab. And I wasn't one of them. But as we progress with the story, it didn't last, that feeling. That was then, that was at the time.
Having experienced the Nakba and having now experienced sort of this, I guess the ongoing Nakba, this new chapter in Gaza, how do you compare them from, I guess from the basic level, from the emotions that they kind of stir up in you when as you've seen it?
Well, look, I painful as the 1948 Nakba was, and shocking, and all the rest of that, I honestly don't think it compares to what is happening now,
Really?
What has happened to the people of Gaza, what is happening to the people of the West Bank. It is so nakedly brutal and cruel and sadistic in a way that the first Nakba was not. Of course, it was cruel in its effects, but I really think what we've been through since October 7th is the worst thing imaginable. It's really the worst thing imaginable. At first, I remember sort of thinking, does this evoke memories? But you'd be surprised, it didn't. It's like a standalone monstrosity, horror of a type I never thought I'd live through anywhere. I mean, in any context.
Well, I guess you've seen kind of the whole progression of Zionist expansionism in Palestine. You've seen and you've dedicated much of your life to Palestine now. How do you assess this progression over time, and in the context of the Nakba, as one continuous movement over time, or has it just been defined by chapters, would you say, as for example now with post-October 7th world?
No, Zionism was the Zionist aim from the start. It's never changed. And all that they've done is that because they're opportunistic, so what they do is, that's why it gives one the impression that it's sort of happening by fits and starts. It's not at all. It's a trajectory they're on to empty the land of its population. That's one part of the aim that they have. Whenever they've seen a chance that arises where they can expel as many people, get rid of as many people, either through killing them or through expelling them, they'll do it. So it's that if you look, you'll see that though the time periods may have differed, the trajectory is the same. So that's the first thing. And that is one aspect of Zionism that, so many so-called liberal commentators just ignore, as if there were nice Zionists, and not so nice Zionists. They're all the same. They're all the same. And that's their aim. That's what they want to do. But there's something about this project, which is extremely nasty. Nastier even than throwing people out and taking their property and taking over. You see, Zionism aimed not just to replace the indigenous population with another set of people they're calling Jews, and then they can kind of rule themselves and get on with life. It wasn't that only. That's what's so pernicious about this. It was to replace the idea of Palestine, the concept of Palestine, its history, its culture, its customs. They have wanted and have been doing, destroying all this in order to replace it with something called Israeli. So unlike so many other conquests in the world, which we know about, where an invader or a colonizer comes in, certainly plunders the place and takes what they want, but they don't attempt to change the culture except of a layer of people they normally work with or work through. But the sort of mass of people are left to do their native things. This is different. This actually wanted to create something called Israel as if it was totally new. It has a particular culture. It has a fake history. It's got all these people imported from outside. I suppose what I'm really trying to say is, it's not well understood, this aspect of Zionism. It really is not. And it's pernicious, utterly pernicious.
When I was last in Palestine, it was shortly before October 7th. And I remember thinking at one point, just with the identity that exists, I was staying mainly in Bethlehem, but also went to other cities around the West Bank. And I remember thinking at that point, they will never manage to get every single person here out. It seemed impossible in my mind. And after 2.5 years of genocide in Gaza, of course, they've completely destroyed the place. They've brought everything down. But the people there remain, and the majority of them remain rooted into the ground, into the lands where they, where they had to flee to post the Nakba, many of them, 80% of them. And so for me, I wonder whether this for you provides a source of hope. I guess the fact that we're still here to tell the story, the fact that you're here still speaking about your experience, the fact that Palestinian identity, I guess especially in the West, has actually become uplifted in the last couple of years.
Yes, sure. Look, I mean, at one level, I have to be impressed by the performance of the Palestinians over all these years. Remember, the enemies of the Palestinians are enormous. How would you expect a small people to actually fight the combined forces of the Zionists and the United States and the Western world? It's just impossible. And yet, they have managed. They have done what they could. They've remained on the international agenda. I mean, they're back more than ever. People know at least who they are. Many people are sympathetic. They care. This isn't by chance. They have their I suppose you would say sumud in Arabic, resilience, whatever. But it's some kind of instinct, sometimes I feel, against erasure. You know, how dare you erase me? I will not be erased. It's something like that. And that's good. Of course, that gives one some hope. But I have to be honest and say there's a limit to even this. If this war against the Palestinians continues by so many different agents all working together to destroy them, I fear for the future.
What led you specifically back to kind of dedicating your time and to raise awareness for Palestine, working in Palestinian initiatives, when in your book you mentioned how you trained to become a doctor? How did that come? Where did you find the energy to start advocating for?
Well, I tell you, I nearly didn't, because I didn't want to become a doctor. I did not want to study medicine. My father, God rest his soul, but nevertheless, he really was. He didn't do me any favors. And he was very anxious. I can understand it from his point of view. You know, here's a Palestinian father who's already lost everything in 1948. He couldn't bear to think of his children facing something like that again. So he was very insistent that we all had to have an education which led us to a qualification, which meant we could work. And that was really what was in his mind. So I would argue with him and say, I do not want to become a doctor. And he would say, or rather my mother would say to him, leave her alone. This is a girl, some man will turn up and, she'll be married and that'll be the end of that.
That will be history.
And my father's answer, which I've never forgotten, he said to my mother, oh, really? And this man turns out to be a bastard, and he drops her and he leaves her. How is she going to earn her living then? Apart from his jaundiced view of marriage, that's aside, that was his thinking. So I'm afraid that I was like a lamb to the slaughter. I had to go through medical school and I became a doctor. And and it didn't satisfy me. It's not what I wanted. And so eventually it was 1967. It was the 1967 war that did it. For me, and I know for Edward Said, whom I knew personally, we both reacted to the 1967 war in the same way. In 1967, as people know, Israel conquered parts of Syria, the Golan Heights, Sinai from Egypt, and very importantly, the West Bank and Gaza. And they have stayed there ever since. It was that defeat of the Arab armies which it really shook me. In my own case, I was working as a junior doctor at the time in an English hospital just outside Bristol. And I thought all these colleagues were friends. And what was my shock when the war was being transmitted on TV, and all these colleagues were cheering the Israelis on and saying, good for you, and clapping and all this. And then I remember, mind you, it wasn't instant, but over time, it brought home to me the fact that we are completely on opposite sides. And these so-called friends are no more friends than anything. And so, but it set me on the road, thinking, well, then who am I? Yeah. And what do I do about it? And slowly, over time, it came to me. I had to do my bit to rescue Palestine. I think that's probably what was in my mind. I'm sure in Edward Said's mind. And we're not alone. You see, if you look at it like this, never mind that I'm Palestinian and that we're talking about Palestine, leaving that out of it, this is a terrible story. It's a story of such arrant injustice, it's such cruelty, such brutality on the part of Israel and its friends. If you weren't Palestinian and you're just human being, you can't bear it. You can't bear it. You cannot pretend that all is well with the world. It's not. And I'm sure that's what's in the mind of so many of the supporters of Palestine ever since October 7th.
We've spoken about your whole kind of story, and I guess as somebody who has survived the Nakba, survived, I guess, this Western, living in this Western sort of idea of what Palestine is as a Palestinian, and now having witnessed the genocide in Gaza, do you have any lessons for anybody who's listening to this, who's watching this right now, from all of your experience from the moment you were born up until now?
Yeah. Look, I urge people to understand that we have to fight evil. What Israel has done and what Israel is in my view, evil, all of it. And those who support Israel are also evil. Now, if you are any kind of a decent human being, you have to fight this. You have to fight it. It's not enough, much as we welcome sympathy and fellow feeling and and kindness, that's not going to do it. The only thing that's going to do it is if people act. They act at whatever level they're able to do, whether it's through their churches, whether it's through their parliamentary representatives. I'm not prescriptive. It can be anything, but you have to act. You cannot sit there in the presence of evil and see it thrive and flourish due to the fact you're doing nothing.
Well, that's everything we've got time for. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.